James Keating. I'm the director of the Humanities Program, and this is the first public event in what we call our Disputatio project, which Dr. Berry will talk about a little bit more. Our idea was better to light a candle than to curse the darkness, and one of the darknesses of the present day is the fact that people don't talk with each other if they disagree on important matters. So it was our idea that we would change that a little bit, at least at Providence College, and begin to host disputatios, disputations, discussions, debates on matters that matter. And we had one that was sort of one on Zoom during COVID time. I can't remember what the title was, but something about phones or something like, right? Or are phones the new cigarettes or something? It was just sort of a dry run for something a little bit more serious. And that's what you will be experiencing today. So, without further ado, I present to you the organizer of the Disputatio project at Providence College, Dr. Richard Berry.
Thank you, everyone. I'm so glad you're here. My name, as Dr. Keane just said, is Rick Berry. I'm assistant professor of theology here at PC. And as he said, this is the second disputation we have had under the auspices of the Humanities Program. Over the years, the Disputatio Project will continue to host a series of debates on issues of contemporary and/or perennial significance in the great Dominican tradition of disputation. This event has two simultaneous purposes. First, to introduce you to the tradition of disputation and to suggest why this approach remains important for the modern world. Second, we will have an opportunity, obviously, to participate in a disputation with our two guests, Drs. Mahoney and Wyllie. Before introducing our speakers, though, a little more about what we're about to do today, and this is about a 5-minute little comment. So, one of the fascinating things about Providence College is that our mission statement explicitly claims that at PC, we, quote, encourage a pedagogy of disputed questions. This is amazing because very few colleges explicitly state a preference for a specific approach to education. This raises obvious questions. What is the disputed question, and why is it so important at PC? The fact is that disputation has been the hallmark of Dominican education since the early 13th century, which is to say, since the time of St. Dominic himself. It was typical for Dominican classes to feature a private disputation every week, and for the entire school community to come together occasionally for major public disputations, like the event we are hosting today. As one scholar explained it, the private disputation was presided over by a master who announced beforehand the question that would be asked. One student designated the opponent, supplied arguments against the thesis, while another, the respondent, attempted to answer the objections that were raised to demonstrate their weaknesses. In the medieval period, after the students went back and forth with objections and responses, the exercise would culminate with the determination, at which point the professor would give his expert assessment on the question based on the issues raised in the debate. In these debates, the goal was to help students to think on their feet, to consider and respond to diverse arguments, and to master the material at a deeper level by engaging it through reasoning together. The overall assumption was that when you ask hard questions and when you subject each position to thoughtful objections, the truth would emerge. Truth, after all, has nothing to fear from challenging questions. While the modern college is, of course, very different from the medieval universities where the first Dominicans flourished, there are also many ways in which our goals are similar. For example, both then and now, we are encouraged to engage classic texts with sophistication and discernment. Then and now, we strive to become better communicators, both in our writing and in our oral presentations, so that we can positively influence others. Then and now, we celebrate rational thinking and dialogical problem solving as the best way to confront challenges. The disputed question is a time-tested, lively, and fun way to pursue these goals in continuity with the Dominican approach to education over 800 years. It is important to note at the outset that we come together at this table not so much as opponents, as partners on the way to truth. By presenting their best arguments on either side of the question, our speakers today will help us all to think deeply and rigorously about a crucial question at the center of the modern Western tradition. How should we think about Karl Marx? What is the legacy of the Communist Manifesto? The hope of the Disputatio project is that by rigorously discussing difficult topics in a spirit of mutual respect and even friendship, we are all aided in our pursuit of veritas. In fact, in the pursuit of truth, one often has no greater friend than a worthy debate partner who can help us to develop fine-tune our thought. With all that in mind, our goal today is to get a sense of how disputation works while exploring an interesting and important topic with the help of two professors who have been wrestling with these questions for many years. Since I have called the disputation, I am serving as the host today. The question I have posed is as follows, and it's on the screen. Do the teachings of Marx and Engels in the Communist Manifesto advance a humane vision of individual and social flourishing? Today we have Professors Daniel Mahoney and Robert Wyllie debating this question. Dr. Mahoney will take the nay position. He will say that the teachings of Marx and Engels do not advance a humane vision of individual and social flourishing. Dr. Mahoney is the Professor Emeritus at Assumption College in Political Science. He has published extensively on the life and thought of Alexander Solzhenitsyn, the Russian novelist, philosopher, and Soviet dissident. His most recent book is The Idol of Our Age, How the Religion of Humanity Subverts Christianity. Dr. Wyllie is the Assistant Professor of Political Science and the Director of the Political Economy Program at Ashland University. He has published on figures as diverse as Thomas Aquinas, Hegel, and Kierkegaard. And at Ashland, Dr. Wyllie teaches, among other courses, Marx, Marxism, and their critics. His upcoming book focuses on the problem of envy in modern political thought. Dr. Wyllie will be taking the yay position. In other words, he will argue that the teachings of Marx and Engels do advance a humane vision of individual and social flourishing. As you can see on the screen here, the disputation will unfold in 4 parts, starting with Dr. Mahoney giving as many reasons as he can for saying no to the question. I have posted time limits for each of the 4 rounds on the board, as you can see, so that you can see how long each round should take. Throughout the debate, please prepare questions to ask the speakers. We'll have a question and answer period at the end. The event will be over around at 4:15 or 4:20, and we ask if it's at all possible that you stay to the end. Please don't fill out the forms we gave you. We're going to ask at the very end that people determine the question. I'll give you some guidance on what that means, and we'll just see how you determine this question as you think through it with us. So we will begin with roughly 12 minutes roughly 10 minutes of objections from Dr. Mahoney to the thesis question. Dr. Mahoney, please.
Well, thank you very much. Even though I'm going to argue, I hope even passionately, that Marx has not aided the cause of human liberty and dignity or individual or social flourishing, I will say Marx is a thinker I've spent decades engaging with, and I think it's worth engaging with Marx, even principally to learn what to avoid. But when it comes to political economy, it seems to me it's impossible to think seriously about the contemporary world without coming to terms with, is this on? Okay, I'll move it a little closer. Without coming to terms with the Marxism of Marx, and without wrestling with the relationship between the Marxism of Marx and Marxist Leninism, Stalinism, Maoism, Castroism, etc. When I think of Marx, the word humane does not come to mind. Marx was not a thinker or actor who placed particular emphasis on the human person in his or her specificity and dignity. Marx's deepest philosophical concern was with humanity, with a capital H, or species being, as he sometimes called it. And I would agree with those philosophers and commentators who've argued, if you look at Marx's positive vision, which is very thinly sketched of what a post-political humanity will look like after the revolution, the dictatorship of the proletariat, the state withering away. If you look at it closely, it's frivolous. Hunting in the morning, fishing in the afternoon, writing criticism in the evening without becoming hunter, fisherman, or critic. The abolition of necessity, the jump from the realm of necessity to the realm of freedom. There's nothing morally significant or demanding or serious about this. This is really Nietzsche's critique of Marx, that this is the last man without serious aspirations or inspirations. And I think, broadly speaking, that's true. Let me follow up here with a wonderfully suggestive quote from Sergei Bulgakov, the great Russian Orthodox philosopher and theologian. So Bulgakov was he was forced out of the youthful Soviet Union on the philosopher's ship in 1922. Dzerzhinsky and Lenin put 150 or 200 of the most significant thinkers, philosophers, theologians, intellectuals, political economists on a boat and shipped them to Frankfurt, Germany. Of course, many of their friends and disciples and collaborators would meet much harsher fates in the Gulag, etc. But Bulgakov says that, and he goes so far as to call Marx a dictatorial type. And he says he has people like Marx have a distinctive peculiarity. They have a straightforward and rather unceremonious attitude toward human individuality. For such persons, people appear as algebraic signs destined to serve as a means for achieving one or another, even if lofty goal. On the other hand, they appear as subjects for a more or less energetic, even if extremely benevolent influence. In theory, this feature is expressed by lack of attention to the concrete, living human person. In other words, by ignoring the problems of the person as an individual. I think that quotation from Bulgakov, who saw applied Marxism up front, speaks for itself. But I would add André Malraux, the great French novelist who later became Minister of Culture under Charles de Gaulle. He once said he stopped being a socialist when he realized that the revolution could not cure traffic accidents and unrequited love. Marx has nothing to say about the ultimate destiny or dignity of the human person. I would also say that Marx's work combines, in a deeply problematic way, what I would call scientism, a deterministic philosophy of history, the argument that the victory of communism is inevitable and inexorable, an ideological Manichaeanism that says some people are guilty, ontologically guilty of who they are, the wrong classes. Aristotle, for example, is fully aware of the distinction between the few and the many. All great political thinkers were. But Aristotle would never say the people are pristine and innocent victims, and the oligarchs or the few or the wealthy or the aristocratic are always exploiters. There's a mixture of rapaciousness and justice on all sides in politics. And I would say even from a biblical point of view, some liberationists and Christian progressivists, they talk about the preferential option for the poor. The church talks about the preferential option for the poor. But we have to understand that in some deep sense, the poor means the poor in spirit, a deep humility before our friend and Father, the Creator God. It does not mean some will to revolutionary affirmation of the human species. Marx in his doctoral dissertation said, above all, resist servility. So you have this prophetism, which is ungrounded scientifically, and you have moral indignation. You don't have morality in Marx, because Marx did not believe in natural right or natural justice. He believed that people's ethical standards and judgments were simply an epiphenomenal reflection of underlying socioeconomic determinants. Problem with this kind of view, it's what the philosopher, scientist Michael Polanyi called, it leads to a moral inversion. There's no official place for morality. It goes underground, and it comes back up as moral fanaticism. We see a lot of that today. People who are officially relativists, who are angry moralists, you know? And I think Marx is a prototype of that kind. I would say in the end, Marx cared more about, he didn't want to change the world, reform the world, improve the world. I think Marx represented he's not an advocate of social justice or a good humanitarian. I think he represents something like a metaphysical rebellion against the human condition. And that's why he could put the whole historical experience of humankind into the category of prehistory, you know? We're not really human beings yet. And that's why his atheism could be so doctrinaire, religion, the opium of the peoples, which, under state Marxism, Marxist-Leninism, Stalinism, Maoism, led to the worst persecutions of religion in human history. You know, the toll, not just of religious believers, but of 100 million lives in the 20th century. So I think we make a mistake. Alistair McIntyre, the famous philosopher at Notre Dame, I have great admiration for, but I heard him give a talk a while ago where he said, well, you know, now that the Soviet Union is gone, we can just face the Marxism on its own terms, and it's a powerful aid to coming to terms with community and fraternity and equality, and I don't think those were really Marxist concerns. And someone like McIntyre is essentially a communitarian. You know, he writes nostalgically and longingly about Icelandic and Irish fishing villages. Well, Marx spoke about the idiocy of rural life. And Marx knew that socialist grace depended on capitalist nature. He's not a Rousseauian, he's not an ecologist, he wouldn't like the Pope's encyclical on climate change. He wanted a rapacious conquest of nature, and that is the only way that humankind can overcome the realm of necessity and enter into the realm of freedom. And one last remark. I think I'm coming against how many more minutes do I have? 1 minute. There's something revolting about Marx's claim in the Communist Manifesto that the charges against communism, remember, communism, as he defines it in the second part of the Communist Manifesto, consists of 4 abolitions. The abolitions of private property, family, religion, and the nation. And he goes on at the end of part 2 of the manifesto to say, the charges against communism made from a religious, philosophical, and generally from an ideological standpoint are not deserving of serious examination. This is why the political philosopher Eric Voegelin called Marx an intellectual swindler. Does it require deep intuition to comprehend that man's ideas, views, and conceptions, in one word, man's consciousness, changes with every change in the conditions of his material existence, in his social relations, in his social life? Our ideas, our religious faith, philosophical belief, questioning, affirmation, all of that is just a byproduct of larger and absolutely determinative socio and economic factors. Marx doesn't have to answer objections to the Marxism of Marx made on philosophical, religious, or political philosophical grounds. Those objections are beneath contempt. I would suggest that is a fundamentally totalitarian objection to the very possibility of both of philosophy, theology, political philosophy, or even empirical social science. I'll end there.
Thank you, Dr. Mahoney. Dr. Wyllie will have about 12 minutes for his response and his initial reply to objections. Dr. Mahoney, let me give you the mic.
Thank you, Professor Barry, and Professor Hain and Pamela Belcher, all the faculty and staff here that invited me. It's a privilege to debate a distinguished scholar whom I admire very much. So I teach political economy at a small university, Ashland University, in a small town in Ohio that attracts students who tend to be conservative, sometimes more conservative than they think. So my Karl Marx seminar must begin by showing them that the most important political economist of all time, why this man was so attractive to so many people. And part of the reason concerns us today, which is that the Manifesto of the Communist Party, which is the most famous of Marx's writings, is a powerful call for us to become more compassionate and benevolent and construct a more compassionate and benevolent vision of flourishing together. I'll say something more on flourishing in a moment. First, I called the Manifesto Marx's writing. Engels is listed as the co-author, and he's the author of a catechism that preceded the Manifesto. But Marx reorganizes it after what his biographer calls ceaseless procrastination, some of you may sympathize, in about a week to meet his last chance deadline of February 1st, 1848. It's an odd manifesto, 60 pages of didactic explanation that all history is class struggle, and why the bourgeoisie has simplified class struggle into two classes, the final struggle of two classes. And it's also odd because it can be read, at least the first half can be read, as what my teacher Alan McGill calls a hymn of praise to the bourgeoisie, sort of the final boss that the proletariat has to face. So here's my argument. Even if Marx's historical predictions are wrong in hindsight, even if Marxists, so-called, committed atrocities in his name, even if we can't calculate socially necessary labor time to make capital work, his book Capital Work, I mean, and avoid the riddle of money, we're not talking about Marxism. We're arguing that Marx's manifesto opens up a humane vision of flourishing that we've lost somehow and which we should find attractive. So first I want to demonstrate something about the humaneness. In the manifesto, communism begins in compassion. You have to read to the third part to get this. And then second, I try to show how the manifesto uncovers a vision of flourishing that's otherwise concealed for us. So humaneness, compassion, benevolence, and then I'll turn to flourishing, thriving, et cetera, and try to respond to Professor Mahoney in so doing. So some context. Marx is writing on behalf of a clandestine network of German emigre revolutionary workers in Western Europe, whom he would like to organize into a public political party in time for the revolutions of 1848, but among whom there's very little organization, and also a considerable diversity of opinion. So take one I'm really interested in, one of these guys is Moses Hess, because he's a Spinozist, and he's a Zionist, and he doesn't like Marx and Engels anyway, because Engels sleeps with his wife. These aren't all people that agree, and Marx is trying to speak on behalf of all of them. So the point is that in the manifesto, Marx is openly publishing a description of views, aims, and tendencies, if you read that preface, plural, of many different communists, all the way from that early Enter the Sandman beginning of the Communist Manifesto about this specter of Marxism, and we have to sleep with one eye open. And he claims he's speaking for these communists in all these different countries. They speak all these different languages. It never does get published in Danish or some of the other languages he mentions. So who are the communists according to Marx? Well, they appear in the generation before him. And they appear when the horrors of the Industrial Revolution are still fresh. Factory deaths, child labor, people moving from villages that their families had always lived on to live in barracks in the great manufacturing cities of England, for example, where Friedrich Engels' father owned a factory. And these first communists, properly so-called, Marx writes, are Saint-Simon, Fourier, Robert Owen, and they're defined by humaneness. They feel, Marx writes, they're conscious of caring chiefly for the interests of the working class as being the most suffering class. Now, Karl Marx doesn't think compassion is enough, that's right, and it's well known that he wishes to put communism on a more scientific basis while even speaking for these other communists in the manifesto. These early communists, Marx thinks, don't understand the reality of the class struggle because they wish to attain their means by peaceful ends. And Marx thinks that this will be impossible. Thus, their disciples avoid these inevitable class antagonisms. But this doesn't mean that Marx discounts the role of compassion for us, or that communists must act politically the same in all countries. By the end, some communists in Poland are allying with agrarians. In France, they're allying with social democrats. In Germany, they're not allying with everyone. And Marx says all that's fine. The diversity of tactics is celebrated as long as communists everywhere support every revolutionary movement against the social and political order of things, he writes. So he can be a blistering critic of compromise and democracy, but he can also be a blistering critic of when other communists don't. And he's mostly, I think it's what Theodor Adorno calls utopianism in the service of the ultimate end, of a practical end, different in different countries. Why does Marx expand our compassion? Well, the Communist Manifesto is one of the first documents about globalization, right? That as an effect of the Industrial Revolution, life is changing all around the world. Cheap commodities are battering down Chinese walls, he writes. An exponentially growing population, child labor, factory deaths. In some ways, this seems like it's part of the past, but by a conservative estimate today, 900 billion people live in temporary dwellings or slums. And there's some way that you can think that the slums today of Lagos or Dhaka are like Manchester and Glasgow in Marx's time. And in some way, Marx thinks about the emergence of a global proletariat. We don't see them, and so they don't strike us as people we have to feel compassion for, even if they make the things we wear and the 39-cent bananas say that we eat in the store. So why is it the case that people were more compassionate before the Industrial Revolution, you might wonder? This is where I think Alistair McIntyre argues that people in the Middle Ages had a better sense about labor and what went into labor and work because they saw the people who labored for them. And if they needed to rule over them, rule was, kissing the ring of the bishop or bowing before the king. You sort of made up a hierarchy or a fantasy, or perhaps that's a real hierarchy. Differences of opinions in this room, I'm sure. But now the only hierarchy is money, and money has to do this role of sort of churning up a hierarchy or fantasizing a hierarchy. And this is why Marx argues that those sort of actual real relationships between people and between people in relations of production that were more intimate in the Middle Ages are gone. Alistair McIntyre argues that the medievals had a better sense of work. If you didn't pay someone a living wage, they died and stunk up your village, but now they don't. And Marx makes us compassionate about this. Oh yeah, the things we buy, the things we consume all over the world, right? This is something we could. So I'm quite impressed by the Communist Manifesto, not only because communism begins in compassion, but Marx calls us to compassion or benevolence or humaneness. And now we live in what Marx calls a global cash nexus that has left remaining no other nexus between man and man than naked self-interest. It has drowned, very famous line, Philistine sentimentalism in the icy waters of egotistical calculation. Professor Mahoney, when he's focused on the manifesto, not always focused on the manifesto. Sometimes he tells you the religion's the opiate of the masses. I can't defend everything in the critique, the contribution of the critique of Hegel's philosophy of right. Marx's thesis on Feuerbach, Marx's militant atheism. I can't defend all of this. But in the Communist Manifesto, the 4 abolitions are all things that Marx argues that the bourgeoisie is responsible for. These are things that are inevitable. There's no going back. So, family. The bourgeoisie has torn away from the family its sentimental veil. And it's the bourgeois who sees in his wife a mere instrument of production, not content with having the wives and daughters of proletarians at their disposal. And besides which, they take the greatest pleasure in seducing one another's wives. This is why we know that Engels probably didn't really co-write it, because he was up to that. Terry Eagleton has a funny joke that Marx theorizes about this, but it's Friedrich Engels who accomplishes the dialectical unity of theory and practice when it comes to abolishing families. Religion. It's the bourgeoisie who convert the priest into a paid wage laborer. Ask Father Brophy what I tipped him to baptize my children, how I rate him. Christian ideas succumbed to a bourgeois rationalism earlier. And Marx doesn't think there's any going back. But it's also not communism that's trying to abolish things that are strong. The nation, to the great chagrin of reactionists, has drawn from under the feet of industry the national ground on which he stood. National differences and antagonisms are vanishing. There are 2 points in the manifesto where Marx comes back to this claim. Even constitutional freedoms at one point, he argues, numberless indefeasible freedoms are reduced simply to free trade. That's a surprising one for Marx. Finally, the most important abolition is property. And it might surprise some of us that Marx thinks that it's the bourgeoisie that has abolished property. And when he argues that the sine qua non, what really makes you a communist is you want the abolition of bourgeois property. And in some way that's different than simply the abolition of property. So what might that mean? This is because the bourgeoisie has already resolved personal worth into exchange value. And Marx doesn't think that we rightly reason about money. Right? So just because a banana costs 39 cents a pound doesn't mean that people didn't put their lives into that, or maybe are starving if the banana crop goes bad, right? Okay. Just because your clothes are cheap, right, doesn't mean that people are being paid a living wage, right? You don't really know from the price system. So I better turn to flourishing for the second half of my talk, which I have a minute for. Okay. The rare Thomist who wants to think about complex moral decision-making, right, and what that's like in a modern political economy, like what you should pay for things, right, like Alistair McIntyre, realizes that price is not a good proxy, right? What should you pay for things? What should they be worth? Maybe some people don't think that you're really morally culpable for buying things just because they're cheaper, even if that results in the suffering of many people around the world. And I'm not here to talk necessarily about justice and that I can really calculate justice, but I think I can say that Marx challenges us to think more humanely and compassionately about that in some way we're implicated. And even if the communist movement did not go precisely the way Karl Marx thought it would, and there I agree with Professor Mahoney on many things, I do find that Karl Marx is very attractive for making us more humane or compassionate.
All right, we now have a 7-minute opportunity for Dr. Mahoney to clarify and draw distinctions to support his view.
Well, thank you. We have, by the way, Professor Wyllie and I do agree on many things, but I think we have a really radical difference about difference in judgment about whether humanitarianism or compassion are meaningful categories for Marx. And I would insist they're not. Marx was a Machiavellian realist in a very extreme sense. He was willing, it's the only philosopher I know of who gave a principled justification of dictatorship. In his 1852 letter to Wedemeyer, in the concluding section of the second part of the Communist Manifesto and elsewhere. And he is quite willing. He celebrated the terror of the Paris Commune of 1871. There's plenty of Leninism. Lenin's the founding father of Soviet communism, and not Stalin. Lenin gave a principled defense of purging Russia of all the harmful insects. And those were, Christians and kulaks and merchants and independent intellectuals, etc. So I just don't see, I think Bulgakov is right. The person is not a category for Marx. He's willing to see individuals and groups castigated in a sweeping way. And his deference to historical determinism and historical inexorability shows a kind of contempt for human freedom and a contempt for moral agency. I think Marx was wrong that the bourgeoisie had simply abolished property, family, religion, and the nation. Now, Marx has some eloquent passages about the first globalizations, about the simplification of human relations from a more patriarchal and hierarchical world to a world where the cash nexus rules. Those remarks are overstated, since things like religion and Republican political commitment and all that were very real in the 19th century. It's a sweeping judgment, but it has some truth to it. But Marx was mainly wrong. The first part of the manifesto argues that capitalism inevitably, scientifically, inexorably leads to immiseration and pauperization. It didn't. In the long run, it led to what Deirdre McCloskey has called the Great Enrichment. It led to the bourgeoisification. People today have complaints about equality, but these are questions about equality within consumer societies, essentially bourgeois societies. There are legitimate questions, I think, about Marxist fundamentalism, market fundamentalism. There's legitimate questions about Marxist fundamentalism, too. But I would say that, if you read the collection Friedrich Hayek edited in the 50s, published by University of Chicago Press, called Capitalism and the Historians, even in conditions of England in the 19th century, there was a significant improvement in the health, the fact that working people could buy tea, for example, which used to be a luxury. There were many excesses associating the Industrial Revolution, but to say that the market economy led to massive and inevitable pauperization and immiseration as the precondition for universal revolution was just empirically false. And it's really guided not by empirical observation, but by certain philosophical presuppositions. I would like to add that Marxists always talk about political economy, but they don't believe in politics because they explain politics as an independent or autonomous realm away. You know, there's a lot of pop Marxism out there. Thomas Frank wrote a book about 15 years ago, Whatever Happened to Kansas? All those working class and lower middle class people voting for the Republicans. Don't they know their class interests? You know, classic Marxist thinking. Well, maybe they're concerned with the fraying of moral life or the undermining of Republican spirit in the United States, or maybe the coarseness of life. Maybe they think socialism isn't a solution to their problems, since they don't want to abolish private property, but they want to share in it, you know. But the idea that the political is simply, I keep on using this word epiphenomenal, that it's nothing more than something that is absolutely and categorically determined by underlying factors. The great holy or unholy trinity today, race, class, gender. You know, the idea that people have agency, that thought might be independent. Engels was a son of a rich capitalist and continued to manage his family estate and send some of the surplus value to Karl Marx on a regular basis. But no one would say Engels' Marxism or communism was determined by his class background. Quite the contrary. So I would say, how much more do I have? A little more than a minute. So, and I would also add, I think Marx is helpful for thinking about globalization, but Marx is an advocate of super globalization. He wanted to get rid of the idiocy of village life. He wanted to get rid of parochial interests. He wanted to get rid of nations. He didn't particularly care about important human values and virtues like self-government. I think a lot of people who turn to Marx because they think he's an egalitarian, a social justice warrior, an economic reformer, an anti-egalitarian. No, I don't think he's any of those things. And I think his positive project, any philosopher or political economist who gives a principled defense of tyranny, even if this is tyranny by an exploited minority, is providing a justification of the unjustifiable. And that is the Leszek Kolakowski, the author of the Polish ex-communist, the author of the greatest work on Marxism, Main Currents of Marxism, says the Marxism of Marx has a direct connection with Leninism and Stalinism. Leninism and Stalinism, the use of terror at the service of the dictatorship of the proletariat, the idea that the market can be abolished or that profit is always thievery. There are consequences from those judgments which are essentially despotic. So the Marx that I engage with, the Marx that I understand, is the opposite of a humanist. He mocked compassion as a foolish preoccupation of utopian socialists as opposed to the kind of scientific determinism that his Marxism, his socialism, represented and embodied. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Mahoney. Dr. Wyllie will have 5 minutes for his concluding response.
All right. So I think Professor Mahoney gives us 5 arguments, and I'll just go through them, I suppose, as he lays them out. So the first argument is that these 4 abolitions of Marx, or the disruptive effect of technology in the world, is something that Marx celebrates, the rise of the family, etc. The second is that Marx gives a principled argument for tyranny or for dictatorship. The third is that a belief in historical necessity, that you're determined in your actions, shows contempt for human freedom. The fourth is that Marx is simply wrong with respect to that history. And the fifth is that Marx doesn't believe in politics, that politics is simply epiphenomenal, he said. Okay.
A beautiful summary, by the way.
Thank you. Let's see if we can have a beautifully devastating set of objections. Okay, maybe not. Let's see. He's a complex figure, and of course I don't agree with everything Marx ever wrote. I fish in the morning. Other things I would want to disclaim too. But fishing in the afternoon, if you fish in a warm climate, it doesn't make any sense. Okay. Anyhow, maybe he wasn't a big fisherman. Unforgivable. But so I don't think Marx wants technology to rearrange rural life or the idiocies of rural life. And I don't think that those utopian socialists, I mentioned Saint-Simon and Fourier and Robert Owen, are foolish at the very beginning of the Industrial Revolution to believe that the Industrial Revolution is not inevitable. These were men that had been writing maybe 30 years before Marx. And I think the inevitability of exponential population growth. I mean, look at a chart of the world's population from the 1820s to now, or the fact that steam power and other forms of, not green energy, not sort of, or not human and animal power, but mechanical power that can be moved anywhere with a sort of artificial power source, right? That this is possible. Imagine thinking that this is totally going to reorganize the entire world, right? I don't think Marx thinks they're foolish. I think Marx thinks that they are 30 years before him and don't have the benefit of hindsight. And of course, we have a lot of hindsight on Marx, that some things that he believed were going to happen, like inevitable dramatic class conflict, that the poor could never become rich, or they couldn't be a middle class, the poor would always become poor and the rich would always become fewer. That's not true. But the question here is whether Marx is humane, and so that's a bit beside the point, right? Marx is not an egalitarian. I don't think that that's true. I don't think equality is something that's particularly important to Marx at all. I think freedom is. And if you think about it, most people's lives, maybe you will be privileged not to be such a person, but most people's lives are spent, most of their waking lives are spent working for a firm that, may not give them much meaning in their life. Their work isn't like their art. It's not their end. It's not their purpose, right? They don't feel connected to it. They soil their diaper while they work in a distribution facility for your Amazon packages, and they run them to your door, and you don't think about them, right? Because you don't read the Communist Manifesto clearly enough, but you should, and you should become more compassionate, and that's the argument. So I think Marx thinks that people should be free to live a life that's sort of meaningful in most of the hours of their lives, and that you should be able to see your world as kind of a product of your labor, things you contributed to. I think he thinks that was easier in the Middle Ages, and it's much harder in modernity, and that's a salient part of our sort of moral decision-making. The second argument and the fifth argument, I think, contradict one another a bit, and I need more explanation about how Marx can both give a principled argument from tyranny and not believe in politics. So Marx thinks that the state is going to wither away. First of all, Marx doesn't really think the state, such as we think about it, really exists. In the manifesto, he says it's just a managing committee for the affairs of the bourgeoisie. And after the revolution, which unfortunately he's quite vague about, he thinks the state will simply wither away. So I don't think he has an argument for tyranny forever or something like that. But in fact, Marx is in an odd way very anti-political. I don't know that inexorability, maybe you believe that the idea that we're all historically determined and we don't have free will shows contempt for human freedom. You may believe that that's true. I might just concede the point to you if I had the same intuition. I'm not sure if I do. But we can certainly feel compassion for people that are not free, right? So I think the third argument. The fourth and then final in my list of arguments is that Marx is wrong with respect to history. Also, maybe a bit beside the point, but I want to say something like no and yes. Marx in some way is not wrong about history. Marx is not wrong about the progress of globalization. When you come to the end of the second part of the Communist Manifesto, you get 10 proposals for things that all communists want, like free education and the socialization of investment. That means a central bank where the government controls most capital investment, and a progressive income tax. There are other proposals there. A lot of these things are earned in the sort of aegis of welfare states, and in some cases they're earned in sort of the violent history of the labor movement, right? They're earned by strikes, they're earned by revolutionary action, in some ways they're earned by throwing bombs. It's not all a peaceful process that capitalism sort of created all of this wealth and people willingly shared it. And in that way, I'm not sure Marx is quite wrong exactly. I think this is sort of exaggerated to some extent, that Marx is simply wrong about the future history of the class struggle, but in many other obvious ways he is wrong, and I'll willingly concede that. Thank you.
Thank you both. That was really a lot of fun. We have roughly at this point 15 minutes for questions. Like I said, my goal is to have us out of here at 4:15. So we'll do 15 minutes for questions and about 5 minutes for summing up determination, and we will be done. So it's our tradition with the Humanities Forum to take the first question from a student. How to handle questions. Obviously, we're going to ask that you make your question as concise as possible, and that both of the respondents also give fairly concise answers. We're going to let each respondent respond to each one. You can pose your question to one particular person, or perhaps even better, you could ask a general question about Marx and the manifesto, and let them both respond. So is anyone ready with the first question?
Hi, my name is Daniel Carrero. I'm addressing Dr. Mahoney particularly. I feel like you maybe I feel like you may not have addressed this directly in your arguments, but I'm curious, how do you respond to Marx's emphasis on labor as a form of like individualization? I think was what Dr. Wyllie was kind of getting at. So yeah, and that retrospective look into the Middle Ages with the importance of labor and being able to see the laborer and the product of that labor. So
Yeah, look, was Marx wrong that you could make an argument that somebody was very friendly to liberal political economy, the French conservative-minded liberal Bertrand de Jouvenel made, that one of the problems in the 19th century with the reduction of human and economic relations to contractarianism was that it was not quite true that, you know, when you're having an economic arrangement between somebody who owns a factory and somebody working for them, it's not a simply equal agreement, you know, and so something was lost when the old paternalism, that larger sense of responsibility. You couldn't say, well, this is a contractual agreement, it's merely formal. There were obligations, human obligations. I think for a long time, the capitalist order drew on that moral capital, that people who were religious-minded, people who had a sense of duty and compassion, etc., did not reduce human life simply to the cash nexus. About labor, I think Marx overstresses the sort of reducing man to a laboring animal. I'm enough of a classic to say that the search for knowledge as an end in itself is an intrinsic and maybe the highest human good. People who live in monasteries are not, they labor, but they're not increasing the GDP. And yet we would say some inestimable goods are at work there. So I think Marx's emphasis on labor is reductive and economistic, but there's some truth to it. But I think surplus value, for example, to say that all profit is simply stealing and exploitation is wrong. It's not to say there can't be exploitative economic relations. You can have excessive oligarchy. But it is to say that there's an element of initiative, entrepreneurship, knowledge, management and all that, that to say all of that is simply a form of theft. Proudhon, one of those utopian socialists, actually a very interesting moral critic of the emerging new bourgeois world, famously said property is theft. My view is more Chestertonian. We want a world where everyone partakes of property. That was the truth of distributism. It wasn't a very realistic approach to political economy. It had a great moral truth to it. And, the peasants in Russia wanted land. They didn't want to have private property abolished. They didn't, 10, 15 million peasants died in what Alexander Solzhenitsyn called the peasant plague. And believe me, the idea that these ordinary, hardworking peasants keeping a little bit of what they've earned and not having it confiscated by a centralized socialist state was, that flows from the premises of Marx and Lenin, and even from this abstract idea of surplus value. So, yeah,
we should have a comment from Dr. Wyllie so we can get to the next question.
So this would be just very brief. I think the Communist Manifesto can get you to a place where you see why Marx might be attractively compassionate. There's another part of Marx that his concepts have some sort of analytical purchase, and we want to think about that. And I think your question about labor moves to that. The first thing I'd say about labor is you can't have a reductionist notion of labor. I think when Marx is thinking about labor, he's thinking about maybe what we could more neutrally call work, and you could think about the art of the romantic genius. So you are here to do your work in the world. And even if you are a little craftsman and you carve your furniture and you you invite me into your house and you make the world that you live in and you feel at home in it. And then it's the displacement about the Industrial Revolution that leaves us unfree. Here I am packing boxes for Amazon. I don't get a bathroom break. I'm soiling my diaper, and now I have to buy my Domino's pizza on Klarna because I have to finance it, right? What happened to the world? How can you say I'm free? I have the right to free speech, but my world is totally bizarre. That's the concept of alienation, that you feel an alien in your own world. I never think Marx gives up that concept, although some people argue he does. Surplus value is important because if you think, well, to defend a concept like surplus value, you have to say that labor gives things value. And frankly, I don't think that's true, but why would someone want to come up with a labor theory of value? Because you want to argue that things are objectively worth something across time, no matter who made them or when they were made. And you're going to want to then say, well, what is essential to the human economic experience that we can measure, right? And Adam Smith has an argument quite like this. It's the toil and tears you would take to get something. It really stunk to build those pyramids too, and all the time they sweat to build them, put labor into it and gave those pyramids a value, and so too the Amazon box that you're packing. And so we can see the value of things, but because we can peg it to a value and compare it across time. I think this gives philosophy a purchase to say what things are worth. And I would say that one problem we have now, and I'm not sure Marx solves the problem, but there's very little way for moral philosophers to step in and tell you what an economic good should be worth. And if that's the case, then when you read Thomas Aquinas in question 77 of the Summa, and he says you can't sell something for more than it's worth, there's no way to do that. I'm not saying Marx is the only way, I'm not saying it's a successful way, but that's why you would want something like a labor theory of value. It's like the last rabbit running before the marginalist revolution.
Just one sentence.
Okay.
When I hear you speaking, and there's some wisdom there, I hear Proudhon. I hear Sismondi, I hear a bit of Rousseau, I hear Alastair McIntyre.
This is the nicest compliment anyone has
moral-
ever given me, Dan.
But I don't hear Marx. That is a more that neo-medievalism, that argument that something's lost in the standardization of human relations, something's lost in the cash nexus. It's a powerful critique. I think Rousseau's critique is much richer than Marx's because it deals with the loss of the weakening of the powers of the soul that come in a certain kind of society that overvalues economism. But I don't think those are the dominant themes in Marx. And I could just say McIntyre wants to restore the ethos of the fishing villages of Iceland and Ireland. Marx wants a globalized post-political state after the dictatorship of the proletariat. I just hear two different spirits. I think this conflation of Proudhon and Marx is interesting, but I also think it's not faithful to the Marxism of Marx.
Yeah. We'll take the next question. Yes, sir.
There we go. Hello, my name is Noah. I have a question. It's specifically about one of Dr. Mahoney's comments, but I think it can be answered by both. I was a little confused from my perception. It seemed like a little bit of a contradiction. Dr. Mahoney, you argue that determinism takes away the agency and freedom of individuals. Yet you also argue that Marx is speaking in broad strokes about general social structures, various major groups, but he doesn't necessarily speak about the human person, the individual. So my question is more about if historical determinism in the Marx sphere is limiting freedom, in your argument, is not the limitation of freedom of general social classes, the limitation of the bourgeois, the limitation of the proletariat, rather than the limitation of individual freedoms? And I think if we're going to stay on the question of humane vision of the individual flourishing, I think that's very separate from the limitation of general social class limitations of freedom.
Marx's determinism is absolutely thoroughgoing. Professor Wyllie is right that he's at once, I would argue, an advocate of a provisional tyranny, a dictatorship of the proletariat, ultimately at the service of the abolition of politics itself. You have the same structure of provisional totalitarianism and long-term anarchy in Lenin's book, State and Revolution. But no, the determinism goes all the way down, and that means, when Václav Havel spoke to the American Congress in February 1990, he said, consciousness determines being and not the other way around. Do you think the congressman from Minnesota got that? That was his way of saying our ideas, our actions, our philosophical reflection, our civic and moral agency has real impact on the world. We're free. And he was, of course, responding and reversing a famous formula of Marx. So Marx is not an advocate of human freedom in either the bourgeois political sense. He mocked bourgeois liberty, formal freedoms. But he's not an advocate of human freedom in the metaphysical sense. Now, he does seem to believe when history comes to an end, and we hunt in the morning, fish in the afternoon, and write criticism in the evening without becoming critic Hunter Fisher, that somehow a kind of frivolous human freedom will flourish. But it's not moral agency as the tradition understands it. And certainly part of his catastrophic optimism is a radical denial that human beings have meaningful moral and civic agency before the institutionalization of perfect communism. And I think Professor Wyllie and I would agree he's extremely vague what that looks like.
Yeah, I think here Professor Mahoney and I do agree. There are Aristotelian Marxists. I don't think Alastair McIntyre wants to go back to the Middle Ages. However, I do think he thinks he downplays the extent to which Marx is a child of Hegel and a grandchild of Spinoza and comes out of these determinists. I do think Marx's determinism is thoroughgoing. But I would also argue that I find a lot of determinists very attractive and humane, which is to say both I disagree with this figure, perhaps, to the extent that I'm committed to a belief that you've actually made a choice in your life once, perhaps. but at the same time, I find them attractive. So Spinoza is a good example, because he's someone I know much better than Marx, even. I'm writing on Spinoza a lot now. Spinoza thinks that a lot of people are superstitious and cruel to one another, and all philosophers do is castigate them for that, and people can't do any better. So he tries to think of a way to philosophize around that. Now, I disagree with that first principle, but I still sort of recognize him as a humane figure. Now, I think, if I can tell tales out of school, a lot of Professor Mahoney's work, I think, argues that this sort of almost making a religion out of humaneness or compassion, or saying all that exists is power, and the best you can do is use your power for the relief of man's estate, but there's no actual human free will, that this sort of lowering of everything to determine power relationships and I frankly think I agree with his critique in the main, but I don't think that we can then say that these early moderns, and including Marx, are inhumane, therefore, or they're not compassionate, because they might not share metaphysical libertarianism, that is, the belief that free will is possible.
Thank you. To ensure that we're out of here in 10 minutes, unfortunately, we can't have any more questions. There is a reception after this, and so hopefully we can all continue the conversation then. I'm just going to say a couple words now about, so two parts of this discussion. One is, what is disputation? How does it work? The other is the actual disputation. Let me say a word about the determination element of the disputation. So, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, in the medieval disputation, the session would conclude with some kind of determination. This gives the debate closure and moves everyone forward. As I have said, the use of determination at Dominican College is ultimately ordered toward the discovery of truth. In other words, it is not a frivolous game intended to see who's the smoothest talker or fastest thinker. Nor does it just raise questions to generate confusion. No, this is an exercise intended to challenge both our presuppositions and our initial answers to see which position stands up to a scrutiny, to see which position is closest to truth. In the medieval college, an expert would settle the question after the debate. Today, we're going to ask you to be the masters of the debate and to determine the question based on your careful assessment of the arguments you have heard today. That raises more questions. When listening to a lively debate, when both sides present their strongest arguments with energy and conviction, how can we determine which side is closest to the truth of the question? So before asking you to fill out your determination card, I just want to present three quick ideas moving us in that direction. First, the debate is not personal. We are in pursuit of the most coherent argument, not just assessing personality, and that means we need to try to set to one side a number of factors. For the moment, we want to bracket factors that may include each person's hairstyle or personal rhetorical skills or any other
I don't
thing
have
like
any
that. Yeah, that's a tough challenge. So instead, let's try to focus on the argument themselves, which is to say the conclusions they drew and the evidence they marshaled in support of those conclusions. Whose arguments stood up best to questioning and engagement? Number two, each of us came into this disputation with certain presuppositions based on our own experiences and political, philosophical, or religious views. There's probably a lot of wisdom in our presuppositions, so we don't want to dismiss those. Rather, if we can, we want to hold those presuppositions lightly in one hand. In the other hand, we should hold on to the debate we just heard and the strength of each person's argument. Is it possible that some of our presuppositions can be modified or enhanced based on the disputation? It is good to be attentive to our presuppositions or biases coming into the debate, and it is good to ask whether some of those presuppositions were fruitfully challenged this afternoon. Finally, at the beginning of the debate, I asked the question, and it's on the board. Do the teachings of Marx and Engels in the Communist Manifesto advance a humane vision of individual and social flourishing? We must now ask who answered this question the best. Disputations inevitably feature tangents and side issues, and that can be very important. Also, it is good to recognize that no question is perfect, And it is not possible to answer any question with an easy yes or no, perhaps. But for our purposes now, which side responded to this question most persuasively as you assess the evidence? So we're going to do that real quick. Go ahead and just give it an answer. Fold it in half. There's some people in back.
Do we get to vote? No, no.
Yes?
Some of those.
All right, here's the answer. The wisdom of the group says, do the teachings of Marx and Engels and the Communist Manifesto advance a humane vision of individual and social flourishing? No! The answer is, by a small margin, no, 66 to 51. All right. Thank you all for coming and staying. Thank you to our guests.